all we do is go, go, go. Yeah, come get your info, you gon' be like, whoa. Heavenly dog, we bout that, ayy. We in the zone, we out here, yeah. Speeding the facts.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Hair of the Dog. I'm Andy Kennedy, and it is midweek. Going to try to get you over the hump day of Wednesday in the freezing cold during a pandemic with everything else that's going on. But we're not going to spend too much time with intros today because we've got a ton of stuff to talk about, and I'm very excited about our special guest today. But before we introduce our guest, I would like to introduce my lovely and talented co-host, Miss Carrie Barber. Good morning, Carrie.
Hey, good morning, Andy. Welcome to this wonderful Wednesday. It is snowing in New Mexico, which is always a good thing. So yeah, not much going on today except, the inauguration. So that's kind of a big deal. And it's funny that is what is trending on Twitter are two important things. First, Snowden is very happy that he's not getting a presidential pardon from Trump. So there's that. But Biden, not Biden, that was Freudian, Steve Bannon may be getting a pardon for stealing funds from Trump supporters, which is an odd thing to pardon somebody for. But I guess if you're Trump, all you're really worried about is the money, not necessarily your supporters. So a lot of them will be left high and dry, particularly those who have been charged at state and federal levels for sedition. So rude awakening there. You break the law, you're on your own. Then with the inauguration coming up, everyone is anticipating across social media, #NotMyPresident. So furthering the divide. And honestly, we've talked about this before. A lot of the voting that happened in November was a vote against rather than for. So it is true that the Biden administration in the first 100 days is going to face probably an unrealistic standard, but that's kind of the nature of where we are. So
I'd have to push back on that and say, what unrealistic to who?
Good point, because for the rest of us who are living in a pandemic, who are unemployed, who are facing eviction, who have medical debt because of this pandemic and, real life, we have, I think, realistic expectations, but the bubble that surrounds neoliberal policymakers, they're not feeling it. And we know this because we're seeing so much of the pushback when we ask for something like force to vote. Force to vote got so much pushback as if we're infantile and don't understand how things actually work. So it's interesting because I'm talking to people who have lived through significant events in our history. Gentleman I talked to was at Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco and was literally shot. And he was out there for equality issues. So we forget our own history and what it took to get small steps forward. So now when we're just asking for force the vote, the condemnation of something so simple is kind of laughable. So yeah, Andy, I got to give it to you. You're always right. But yes, that is the pushback. So we'll see how it goes. I am not going to hold my breath, even though I look great in blue.
Well, there's a interesting dynamic going on right now because of the pandemic and the lockdown. There's very little traveling that we can do in Ontario, right? There's only specific reasons why you should go anywhere in your vehicle, and those are, going to some kind of medical appointment or going to buy food or something that is essential and not just, driving and hanging out down at the lake or whatever, right? So there's always a worry that there's not going to be enough popcorn for us at the border watching the freak show south of us, right?
Okay. All right. Okay. I get it. We are your toothless, shoeless cousins. And boy, isn't that getting more and more true as we move forward with this? It's incredible. Yeah, sorry. Okay. Yeah. I think the most telling thing for me is when we appeared on page 6 of the Kenya newspaper going, shithole country, right? And I can't argue. I can't argue with any of that. That is where we've come. But this is not something that just happened under Trump, by the way. This is a gradual progression that we've gotten to, like the frog in boiling water. This is part of the third way Dems. This is part of the great lie of how we're going to pay for it, which we'll get into as soon as we bring on our most esteemed guest this morning. Super excited. But Andy, I'm going to give you the honors of bringing on our guests because you guys know each other from quite a bit of work that you've done in the past.
Right. And Dr./Professor Fadhel Kaboub is an associate professor at Denison University in Ohio. He is also the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity and a dear friend and a wonderful human being. I'd like to introduce Fadhel. Thank you very much for coming on our show today, sir.
Thank you for having me on the show. Good morning, Andy and Carrie and everybody watching today.
So we're going to get right into it because we've got a lot to talk about and a lot to discover here because we were talking earlier, we're not necessarily an outlet for progressive policies per se and explanations. But I would like to take a moment before we start, if you wanted to, we're going to talk about the job guarantee and that policy that you are pushing forward in some new ways, and if you could briefly describe what the job guarantee is.
So the idea of the job guarantee came into being simply because the system we live in, the capitalist system, is characterized by technological change. And technological change means that industries are constantly upgrading, which means they're constantly moving towards more efficiency from a labor savings perspective. So new technologies usually help us produce better, faster, cheaper, hopefully cleaner, not always cleaner and safer, but it's definitely trying to displace workers almost by design. So the question becomes, what do those displaced workers from the obsolete industries do when their jobs are destroyed? And, under normal circumstances, you're told those workers, they're supposed to, get new training, new education, new skills, and move on to the new industries. So there's no automatic mechanism that actually allows workers to transition from the older industries that's been displaced to newer industries that are being created, especially workers mid-career, right, in terms of skills and education and so on. So the idea of a job guarantee is to have an automatic system in place that takes workers as they are, where they are, and does on-the-job paid training to transition into those new industries, to transition into the new economy. And because the system never automatically creates full employment, never automatically creates enough jobs in the private sector for everybody who's ready, willing, and able to work, this becomes the safety net in the labor market that allows people who actually want to work to find work at decent wages and decent benefits, no matter what's happening in the private sector. So the idea here is that we're not going to replace the private sector, we're going to complement the private sector. So private sector does what it does, right? It creates new industries, new jobs, new technology, and it hires the workers that it needs. It doesn't hire more than what a particular industry or company needs. So that leaves millions of people behind typically who really want to work. They're not people who are interested in being on welfare or going on vacation permanently or whatever some people say sometimes in the media. So what do we do when we have millions of people who actually want to work? The idea is very simple. We find areas in the economy and society where the private sector is not providing services, and we hire people at decent wages with benefits to do local work, maintain their skills, build new skills, acquire new education and experience in order to transition either into the new industries or to transition permanently into new service areas that the community actually needs. And the idea here is that the government is the only entity that can do this. We can't expect the private sector to do it. We can't expect the nonprofit sector to be able to absorb all the unemployed and to offer all the social services. So this is where the federal government is the entity that is capable of absorbing this. And even better, the federal government in the US, for example, does this all the time, except not in the labor market. So the typical area where governments intervene to absorb a surplus of a commodity, in this case, a labor commodity, is the actual commodities market. So most countries have a mechanism to stabilize prices in key industries, in key agricultural areas in particular. So the price of wheat, the price of corn, the price of, I'm trying to think of what's your Canadian thing, syrup?
Maple syrup.
Maple syrup, right? So there's a buffer stock, seriously, there's a buffer stock mechanism, and governments regulate these key industries in order to keep their prices stable, in order to keep the producers in those industries afloat during fluctuations. So let's take an example. Let's say the farmers who normally produce wheat have been massively productive this year, and they flood the market with wheat output this season. What happens to wheat prices? You have so much wheat, but not enough demand to absorb it. The price of wheat moves towards zero, right? Closer to zero. And that would ruin the farmers and the businesses that rely on that particular commodity. And that's not good for anybody, right? To destroy people's livelihood and to destroy an industry. So what does the government do? The government steps in as a buyer of last resort. And the government will buy enough of the surplus to allow the price to rise away from zero, to rise to a reasonable level that keeps it reasonably profitable for producers. Now, what do we do with that surplus? It's stored away in massive warehouses, massive caves all over the country. And it's meant to be that buffer that the government can use during bad economic times. So let's say 2 years down the road, there's forest fires, there's floods, there's drought, or whatever the conditions are. And now wheat producers are actually not able to produce enough for the economy. So we have a shortage of wheat. What happens when you have a shortage of wheat in the system? The price of wheat starts to skyrocket and causes food price inflation for consumers, which is not good either. So this is when the government steps in and uses that buffer stock that's been saved in reserves and steps in as a seller of last resort to supplement what the private sector is not able to do during that crisis. In this way, the government can keep the price of wheat reasonably low for consumers to afford it, but also reasonably high for producers to stay in business. And that's what the government does. It steps in and steps out to complement the market as needed. And the idea here is price stability. That's why we call this buffer stock mechanism a price anchor. And we do this in key areas in order to stabilize prices, in order to stabilize the economy, except we don't do it in the most important market, which is the labor market. The most important market is not the market for wheat or corn or meat or whatever other commodities different countries stabilize. So it's very simple. The government steps in to complement what the private sector is not doing. So when the private sector hires millions of people and leaves, 25 million people unemployed, the government steps in and hires those 25 million people during a recession. What are they going to do? We're not going to tell them move to San Francisco, learn how to code because that's where the jobs are. We're going to tell them, you stay where you are, you do on-the-job paid training for services that are undersupplied or completely not supplied by the private sector in your community. So that, goes into areas that include environmental issues, caring for the planet, caring for kids, caring for the elderly, caring for people in general. Areas that are typically provided by the nonprofit sector, by charities. And these charities, typically, they tend to be, they need funding and staff the most during bad economic times. And guess what? During bad economic times, they lose funding too. So here we provide kind of a matchmaking process at the very local level where communities will decide these are the things that we need that the market is not providing, that the state is not providing, that the city is not providing, at least not providing enough of. And these are the skills required to perform those tasks. And if the skills needed match the skills of the local unemployed population, then we have a match and we can actually get this done with funding from the federal government. And if the skills don't perfectly match the needs of the community, then this is an opportunity for on-the-job paid training. And this way we have permanent full employment no matter what's happening in the private sector. So
and I'm very glad that you just brought that part up, because one of the things that I think a job guarantee does is it has the potential to redefine how we think of what a job actually should be, right? Because up until now, everybody that works, with the exception of people that work within the government structure now, right, have always been defined by large corporations and businesses, right? And when people think of jobs, they think of things that are unpleasant, that are, difficult to do, and they're not supposed to be something that you enjoy. Right. And so if you're relying on that system that is meant to, maximize profits, right, you're expecting those things, the people that work for them to survive. So how do we change the narrative with a job guarantee about what's defined as a job?
Well, offering a public option allows us to begin the process of redefining those jobs. So, for example, if you're working in miserable conditions, low pay, no benefits, no upward mobility, no childcare provided, no retirement benefits, and in the private sector, and then all of a sudden there's a job guarantee program, federally funded, locally organized, that pays you a decent wage, pays you benefits, offers you educational opportunities to upgrade your skills, to move up the ladder over time, and pays better. Why would you stay in a miserable job when you have a better option, better working conditions, safer working conditions, pays better, right? So that forces the private sector to at least match what is being offered by the job guarantee, what is being matched as a package in terms of wages and benefits and workplace safety and condition and workplace treatment and so on. So that becomes the minimum standard that we as a society accept in the labor market. So that begins the process.
Wait, I got to push back on this a little bit because I see two issues here. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you talked about it's, I let's say I get laid off and I'm making upwards of $15 to $25 an hour salary worker. So if I understand correctly, the problem that I have is I can go on unemployment at a portion of my salary for 6 months to a year. If I go to this federal jobs guarantee, aren't I just making minimum wage? That's not a livable wage, right? So yeah. For me, it seems like that's going to be a major drawback. So we're pulling people down yet again. So explain this. Why would I be supportive of this?
So very good question. So the job guarantee that I advocate for and many of my colleagues advocate for doesn't go with minimum wage. Minimum wage in the US needs to be, should have been upgraded years ago, right? Hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll see a little bit of improvement on that front. But even if it's minimum wage, somebody who has access to unemployment benefits for 6 months, they have the option to stay on unemployment benefit for 6 months if it actually offers higher monthly income than a job guarantee. Absolutely. If that's the option available, stay on unemployment. But what happens after those 6 months when that expires? There is no safety net. People are left with nothing, essentially. So this is meant to be the safety net. That's why sometimes we refer to it as the employer of last resort, right? That allows people to, retool their skills because there's on-the-job paid training. It allows them access to benefits because your healthcare benefits will be gone because in the U.S. these are attached to your employment. So a lot of people lose their healthcare benefits once they're unemployed. So all of these things allow us to have a basis that we start with in terms of what a decent quality of life at a minimum. The other thing to keep in mind is that when we have a permanent full employment program, like a job guarantee program, it creates a whole different macroeconomic reality in the sense that businesses who are about to plan an expansion, for example, expanding, opening a new store or expanding their production, they face the uncertainty of the future. And the uncertainty of the future is about, will I have the same level of customers or more customers in the next 6 months, 2 years, 3 years? We simply don't know. We can't predict the future with perfect certainty. And the level of expected demand as a result, it will be the level of expected profits for a particular company, depends on how many people will actually maintain their jobs in 6 months and 2 years and 3 years. And we simply don't know that. It's uncertain. But with the job guarantee program, we know for a fact that no matter what happens in the private sector, that workers will not drop from making whatever level of income they're making to zero. They may drop from whatever they're making to whatever the job guarantee is offering. So it offers this minimum level of income and support that guarantees that those workers in the next 6 months and 2 years will have more or less an adequate level of spending to support those businesses in the future. Whereas if we don't have a job guarantee, we always face the uncertainty. Most of my customers will lose their jobs and I'm not going to have any customers. Why should I expand today, right? And this is the uncertainty that businesses face all the time. So it's really about setting a minimum standard for individuals themselves so that they know no matter what happens, they can fall back on a standard of living that is dignified versus the current system that says you fall back on unemployment benefits for 6 months and then there's nothing, right? And the final point has to do with what the private sector has been telling us for years about who they prefer to hire. So if you have a choice between hiring somebody who's working for a competitor in the industry, for example, versus somebody who's been unemployed for 2.5 years, versus somebody who just lost their job, versus somebody who's unemployed but is engaged in community service work as a volunteer, right? And the top of the list is always, in all of these employer surveys, is the top candidate is somebody who's working for a competitor, who's already working, right? Not even unemployed. That's the first choice, always. The second choice is somebody who's unemployed, ideally recently, but is still engaged in economic activity as a volunteer. Why? Because being engaged in volunteer work or work of any kind means that you're sharp in terms of your social skills, means that you're motivated, means that your skills are being maintained. We have tons of studies showing that the longer the unemployment period lasts, the more the skills, professional skills and technical skills deteriorate. And this is true for any human being. You stay away from, practicing a foreign language is just, it becomes rusty, right? So what the job guarantee does, it offers you this automatic system that allows you to maintain your skills, sharpen your skills. And after, 3 months or 6 months or whatever it is that you're doing that, you have a letter of recommendation from a supervisor, you have something to show for it. So these are the kinds of things that will allow people to quickly transition back into the private sector or figure out their own, ventures if they wanted to venture into a new business that they want to start or something like that. So that's the safety net that the job guarantee offers, which is why it's very popular, right? It's very popular with workers today in the U.S.
I want to follow up on that and pull in a question that came in over the web here. So it almost sounds like, and clarify if I'm wrong on this, it almost sounds like this job guarantee is actually catering to Main Street rather than Wall Street. So that you talked about the commerce portion of it, and we see right now where small businesses are closing and things like that. So it sounds good, but on the flip side, the powers that be and those people that are in charge, are betters, for lack of a better term. They've been focusing on the stock market and Wall Street, and we saw that transition of, I forget what it was, like $10 trillion in April and May last year. Obviously, that's where we need to put our focus, right, with big corporations, because they dominate the landscape and they're really the employers that we want to keep. But what you're suggesting is just the opposite, and that really doesn't make a lot of sense. Explain this to me. Why are you taking this different focus?
So let's talk about corporations and how they would interact with the job guarantee. Well, if you're so there's this argument that people use where they say, if we have unemployment, which is the current system, it serves as a disciplining tool for workers, so that when you have a job, what the alternative is unemployment with no safety net, and your life is ruined. So it gives you this incentive to accept whatever working conditions we offer you, to accept whatever wages, whatever benefits we offer you, because the alternative is miserable, right? And what we say in the job guarantee literature is actually the unemployed, in the especially long-term unemployed, are actually an empty threat when it comes to competition for jobs, because of what I described earlier, because employers actually don't prefer the unemployed to replace you if you're slacking on the job. They prefer to hire somebody who's working for a competitor. So when we have a job guarantee system, it actually lifts up the standard for everybody, because now if you're not performing on the job in the private sector, there is actually a more serious threat for your job, which is somebody who's doing a job guarantee program, who's actually up to speed with skills, with professional performance, and is actually a potential replacement for you on the job. So if anything, the job guarantee lifts up the standard in terms of productivity and performance, because it provides a pool of employable, ready-to-go workers, as opposed to the current system, which provides potentially a large pool of what they call unemployable workers, because they've been unemployed for so long, their skills have deteriorated, they didn't improve their experience, and so on. So there's that component. To go back to your question, which is related to this, how do the big corporations react to a job guarantee? Well, on the other hand, on the one hand, they want higher productivity. They want people to be more motivated, more available, ready to go with skills and experience and training. On the other hand, they want to keep the standards low, right? They want to keep the cost of hiring workers and benefits and so on low, which means when you have a job guarantee system in place, workers will be empowered to demand at least what the job guarantee system offers in terms of benefits and safety and standards, if not more. And of course, based on skills, based on experience. So everybody will have to raise the level of wages and benefits and workplace conditions to at least match that. And that means for a company like Walmart, for a company like Amazon, it means redistributing from the top, from the CEOs and shareholders, down to their workers. Otherwise, they lose their workers, because their workers will prefer a community development job guarantee that offers better wages and workplace conditions than an Amazon warehouse. So that's the threat for corporations. They see this as a permanent pressure point to force them to offer decent wages, decent benefits, and redistribute from shareholders to their workers. So we as a society, why would we oppose that if it offers a decent level of wages? So as a corporation, now you have an additional cost of doing business, right? Because that's the way they see it. So how do you pay for it as a business, as an Amazon? You either redistribute from the top, right, to offer better wages for your benefits, so fewer, revenues for your shareholders and so on, lower. When I say lower, they're still going to get millions, right? Lower, salaries and bonuses, and for top executives. The other option is to figure out a way of reducing your labor cost over time, which is technological innovation. So instead of delivery people and workers in the warehouse, you get robots to do it, right? You get drones to do it. So that starts a new wave of technological innovation. And technological innovation is always cost cutting, right? To replace workers. And when we have that, we as a society have to think about this. And a lot of people say, oh my God, the robots are coming. They're taking away our jobs. We need to stop the robots from happening. And this is not a new thing. This has been going on from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The term, the Luddites, in England, the Luddites were actual workers who used to break into factories in the middle of the night and destroy the machines, who were stealing their jobs and destroying their livelihood. They thought if we destroy the machines, we'll stop technological innovation. Well, of course, it never stopped. But at the same time, every time we create new technology, it displaces workers, but it also creates new products, new markets, and new employment opportunities. But the employment opportunities, every time we have technological innovation, the employment opportunities always require higher levels of technical skills, education, and experience. We never go back in terms of the skills needed. The skills are always higher. So that tells us as a society, number one, we're never going to stop technological innovation. Number two, we should not resist it. If the robots are coming, we should plan a big party for them, in the sense that we should let the robots do all the painful work, all the dangerous work, all the precarious work, all the repetitive work, all the mind-numbing work, and use a job guarantee program to create meaningful, dignified, well-paying jobs for people who want to work, so that we improve our quality of life, right? And that's the purpose of technological innovation, is to make our lives better, easier, healthier, cleaner, faster, right? That should be the goal. The question is, will the private sector organize that for us? Absolutely not. That's why the job guarantee becomes this mechanism, automatic mechanism that says, let those companies innovate and invent robots to replace workers doing the repetitive, painful, dangerous work in the factories and the mines and so on. And now let's find decent, meaningful employment opportunities for people in their own communities to care for the elderly, to care for children, to care for the planet, right? To raise our quality of life. So those are the choices. You either have nothing and no safety net, or we set up a job guarantee and force companies to redistribute from the top to the bottom. Or if they don't want to redistribute from the top to the bottom on a large scale, permanent scale, they're going to have to innovate and come up with technologies that reduces the quantity of labor that they need. And that reinforces the need for the job guarantee and raises our quality of life overall. So those are the kind of choices we have. And that becomes a social and political question, to go back to your initial question. Will Wall Street be on board with this? Will Amazon be on board with this? They don't want the pressure, right? They want the system as is because it benefits them.
Okay, so one follow-up question came to that, which is kind of on the subject that you were talking about. So this question says, you said this can push companies to at least match the benefits offered by the jobs guarantee. Mm-hmm. How do you then counteract the argument that is often made by taxation is theft people, that this is an infringement on the rights of companies to decide freely what the worth of a job is?
So it's a competitive system, right? This is not taxation. We're not forcing them to do anything. We're saying, if you want to compete, we as a society decided a minimum, livable wage is $17 an hour, and it must include retirement benefits. It must include health benefits. So whatever we as a society decide. And this is not something new. We've done this. I'll give you one example that most people will understand. When we had slavery and society decided this is not what we should, accept as a society. We can't enslave people. We need to pay people wages for their work. What did the slave owner say? I said, that's not fair. That's going to destroy my business. My business model doesn't work if I have to pay, human beings. I have to pay them wages, right? When they used to do the work for free under a slavery system. So what did society say? If your business model doesn't work with paying people wages, then you should be out of business. We will not accept this. And somebody else will step in and innovate and organize their workforce better and pay them decent wages and still make a profit, right? So that is where society sets the minimum standard that is acceptable from a human rights standpoint to begin with, right? If people can't live on wages, can't survive on wages, then we're really going back to slave-like conditions, right? So that is what we're saying. We're saying it's unacceptable for companies that make hundreds of billions of dollars, in revenues and profits, to have their own workers unable to pay rent, unable to get medical treatment, unable to feed their kids. It's just unacceptable, right? Especially when the technology is there, when the resources are there, when the money is there, when they can actually afford to redistribute from shareholders to workers, right? And the additional benefit of paying workers a decent wage from a macro perspective, forget about the social and humanitarian perspective. From a macro perspective, what do workers do with their income? There's an old phrase from a famous economist from the 1930s and 40s, where he said, workers spend what they get, and capitalists get what they spend. So workers, whatever you pay them, they spend it, right? Because it's relatively low. They spend all of their income on consumption, right? And capitalists get what they spend. Capitalists as a group, whatever they spend on wages, whatever they spend in terms of investment, building businesses and so on, they get it back in revenues. They get it back in profits, right? As a group, right? Some capitalists fail, obviously, here and there. So because workers spend everything they get, they spend it back into the economy, it goes back to the capitalist class. So it's a win-win situation. You pay your workers a higher wage, you give them stronger purchasing power. What are they going to do with it? They're going to go out and spend it in businesses that capitalists own. So think of a couple of years ago, actually, Walmart did this without any government regulation. Walmart decided to raise their wage to, $10.50 or $11, and they give their workers a bonus, right? An annual bonus. It was a big PR thing. People were, going crazy about it, that, look, the capitalists are doing the right thing finally. Well, what did those employees do as soon as they got their bonus? They work at Walmart. They turned around and bought more groceries and more things from Walmart. So that was a boost to Walmart's business. They handed this bonus, they got this big PR splash, and then they got more sales and revenues out of it too. So that's what I'm talking about here.
Right. Now, in 2008, when the great financial crisis hit, and this was all due to, the market crashing and the predatory lending that was happening, the fraud and the corruption in the banking industry and the housing market and mortgage houses and all that stuff, tens of millions of Americans lost their jobs, lost their homes, lost their health care. It was a horrible time in the history of the United States in that time. Imagine what would have happened had a job guarantee been in place when that happened, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's the job guarantee is not a silver bullet that's going to solve all of our problems, right? But it means that you don't have to go on food stamps. It means that you don't have to starve. It means that you don't have to become homeless because you have no source of income to pay rent. So it means that you can afford healthcare. It means that your kids can still enroll in after school programs and summer camps because you have, access to a job and it means also you can, withstand the recession, the length of the recession, by allowing you to build new skills, retool, reorient your professional career, without having to, worry about, well, if I go to school, I'm going to get student loans and I have no income to support my family. It's just not an option, right? So when you're unemployed, you have no opportunities, very little in terms of opportunities to retooling and reorienting your skills, especially if you have a family, right? If you're young and single, you can say, well, I'm going to go to school for a couple of years, try to, muddle through with student loans or something like that. With a job guarantee, you don't have to do that because you have that guaranteed employment and it's flexible. It's not necessarily full-time for everybody. Some people need it full-time, some people need it part-time. And it does include on-the-job paid training, including access to community college classes to allow you for technical and vocational training and so on.
So a question came in, and I think this is relevant because it almost sounds like, not that this replaces a UBI, but it's like the productive example of what a UBI could be. So you're not just getting a check, you're actually working for it, developing skills and adding to GDP. So the question came in, what about somebody who stays home and takes care of an elderly family member or a child? How is this going to affect them?
So I've said this many times, and I think most of my colleagues in the MMT, modern monetary theory community, agree that what we should have as a society, as in the United States, because we can afford these things, is number one, what I call universal public services. So education, health, transportation, public parks, you name it, all of those things. Then the next layer is a job guarantee for people who want to work, right? Because we have a lot of people who want to work. And then the third layer is a generous income support. Think of it as expanded Social Security benefits for people who can't work, right? So where does this particular example fit in? People taking care of an elderly parent or taking care of children at home. That's that unpaid kind of home care work. To me and to most of my colleagues in the job guarantee literature, that's a job guarantee too, right? So taking care of an elderly parent, taking care of children should be paid as a job guarantee service with decent wages and benefits, including retirement benefits and so on. Because it's not fair for somebody to do the most valuable work to society, to their community, to their family, to be excluded from the labor market for the first 10 years or so of the life of their children, or for the last 10 years of the life of an elderly, family member. Just because they're doing the right thing, they get penalized by the private sector, by the government, by not having any source of income and any recognition that this was valuable work that can allow them to transition back into the labor market later if they decided they wanted to do that. During a pandemic, some people ask me, well, during the pandemic, we can't have a job guaranteeing people working. Well, the most important job we ask people to do during the pandemic is to stay home, right? And that's a job guarantee in pandemic mode. That's the most valuable thing you can offer society, is to stop spreading the virus. And if you can work remotely, you can do it. If you can't work remotely, then that's the valuable job you're doing, is you're keeping your community and your family and the rest of the country safe. So these are the ways I see this. It's a system that's designed not to leave anybody behind, because we have millions of people who want to work but can't find anything in the private sector. We have a climate crisis. We have a care-giving crisis in this country, and this is pre-pandemic, obviously, not just during the pandemic. And yet we're saying, there's nothing we can do about it. We have millions of people who want to work. We have the need for it. We have the resources. And it's just this matchmaking process that the job guarantee does in a way that creates this safety net for the entire system.
Right. And the other thing I think that we want to clarify as well, that if we understand the macro behind this and the fact that the United States can basically pay for any situation like this, is that if you're going to, let's say, part of the progressive agenda is the Green New Deal, which would need a massive amount of people working to make the changes to switch systems from the fossil fuel to renewables, right? Mm-hmm. That's going to require a huge number of people. And we could say that, okay, well, why don't we use a job guarantee to employ people in those fields mm-hmm. to make that change? But the other part of that you could say is that, well, no, what we could do is the government could just hire people to do that, separate from the job guarantee, right? Because of, if we need skilled people to do that, to work for the government to make those changes, then you just hire them. You don't call it a job guarantee. You just hire those people to do that. And that's something that goes part and parcel with the job guarantee, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. This concept of a just transition, especially as we should be transitioning into renewable energy, green infrastructure, and so on. This becomes a very, very important point to elaborate on. And Carrie, this goes back to your earlier question: what happens when I lose my job, and then do I move to a minimum wage job? So this is very important. So imagine you're a worker in the fossil fuel industry, and you've been in the industry for, say, 20 years. So you're like mid-career, close to retirement, but not close enough. You have, say, 10 years to go or something like that. And you're making six-figure salary in the fossil fuel industry as a truck driver, or as a, somebody working in, delivering coal over the river and things like that. And those are real salaries that people make. And then some people in the Green New Deal community say, well, we're going to have a just transition for you, and it's going to be a job guarantee in the community development space, and it's going to pay $15 an hour plus benefits, right? Nobody's going to accept that in the fossil fuel. Why should I drop from 120 to making 50 or 60, right? That's not a just transition, right? So what we need to do is identify, because this is going to be a very tricky transition, and we need to do it rapidly. So for the new people that we're hiring, people who are unemployed or younger people who are entering the industry, we should funnel those individuals into the green industry with decent starting salaries as 60, 70, and so on. And then they build from there for the rest of their careers. But for the individuals who are stuck in the middle of their career, and that's why they're really defensive about this. They're not against clean air and clean water and better paying jobs for everybody, but they're saying, how about us? We make 120 a year, and you're dropping me to a 60 or a 70. I'm not going to accept that. So those labor unions typically align their economic interest with the interests of the fossil fuel industry. But their personal and social and humanitarian interest is with the environmental movement, obviously, with the rest of us. So how do we guarantee a just transition and accelerate the transition without throwing those individuals under the bus? Because this is another thing they say. We've been promised things before, and workers typically get thrown under the bus. So what we need to do is have the federal government guarantee that transition with the same salary and benefits package. Doesn't have to be just salary, but retirement benefits, healthcare benefits, whatever additional benefits are included. Say we're going to guarantee this transition if you move from the fossil fuel industry to solar or wind or other industries that we're developing under the Green New Deal. And we're going to grandfather in those individuals with current levels of wages and benefits and so on, so that their economic security is guaranteed until retirement and post-retirement. Then we worry about the younger people who are entering the industry. As those fossil fuel jobs get eliminated, they're early in their career, they're gonna be offered the newer jobs and the greener industries with a much broader benefits package, which includes health, which includes education, which includes childcare, which includes retirement benefits. Because with the Green New Deal, we're redoing the entire socioeconomic ecosystem that goes with the job, right? So I think that's the fairest thing, and it's not reasonable to expect that businesses are going to do this for their workers. They're not going to do it unless the federal government, applies pressure and foots some of the bill to make sure that none of those workers are thrown under the bus and told, well, here's a $60,000 job, take it or leave it.
So this almost sounds like, this is a bad example, I get that, but it almost sounds like the FDIC deposit insurance for banks that the government guarantees is now that same principle being applied to wages for the private employee. So that's not a bad thing. But then the pushback on that is when we saw the advent of Obamacare and ACA, you had the federal government pledging 90% of the cost for expanding Medicaid within the states. And you had state leaders say no. So all of this sounds great.
Yeah.
It's not already a plan for a reason. How are you going to overcome the obstacles?
So in the U.S., we have this, hodgepodge system of unemployment insurance that differs from state to state. And we've seen this in recent months with the pandemic, when the federal government wanted to step in and provide additional unemployment benefits. It was a tricky exercise to figure out which state does what and how much. Same thing with healthcare, the way we provide Medicare. It's these things that are funded by the federal government, but then organized or applied differently in different states. We need to have, we need to have a coherent, smooth, consistent mechanism for the jobs transition, for healthcare, for all of these benefits, for unemployment benefits and so on. So the fact that it was done that way during the pandemic, it was done that way during the transition to Obamacare, should mean that we should double our efforts to eliminate those inconsistencies. Otherwise, it's going to be people, thrown under the bus and suffering the consequences. The good news is that the workers in the fossil fuel industry, at least in mining, for example, it's a relatively small number of people for the size of the U.S. economy. So we're not talking about dozens of millions of workers. In coal mining, we're literally talking about less than 50,000 workers, in a few states. So we have to, micro-target where this economic activity happening and where that transition is going to be the most painful for workers, and make sure that the transition happens in a fair and just and dignified way. It's going to be more challenging in the trucking industry because it's all over the place and it's lots of workers and so on. But it doesn't mean it's impossible, right? Guaranteeing the transition. The other thing is that we're not going to get rid of trucking in the next 3 months, right? It's going to be a transition. We're going to have to build the alternative infrastructure for it. And that alternative infrastructure will have to absorb quite a bit of the trucking business. And then again, it's going to vary based on, how far are you in your career? What's the overall benefits package that you get right now versus what you get under the new program? So you may be making 6 figures in terms of income, but have very little in benefits in terms of health or retirement or educational benefits. So we can compensate. So under the new system, you may be making 95, but compensated with more generous benefits and support system, right? This way, the overall, quality of life transition is comparable when you compare the full package.
And there's also, we wanted to mention that it's not just those industries that are going to potentially change, right? When we talk about progressive policies, there's an entire, industry of people that work in the healthcare or the health insurance industry, right? That
billing and paperwork, yeah.
Right. That if we're talking about advocating for Medicare for all, that all of those people potentially could lose their jobs. And so that just transition also, will be a safety measure for those people as well.
Absolutely. And so the key industries are fossil fuel and healthcare, but all industries are always on the table because technological innovation always requires higher levels of skills and education and always moves towards labor-saving technology. So all industries are always on the move, which means we have to have this permanent program, not just for healthcare, billing and paperwork, employees in the healthcare industry or fossil fuel industry during this big transition. It's going to be needed no matter what. We always need a job guarantee to help people transition.
Right. We've also seen that typically when people lose employment, or you have like rural communities or small towns where a factory that's employed the majority of people in those small areas shuts down, all of those people become unemployed. There's no jobs for those people in the private sector anywhere near, and so there's a move towards large cities where most of the jobs can be found anyways, right?
Right, and it's a domino effect, because then what happens to those small towns, because the way we fund school districts, because of property tax values and so on, that becomes a downward spiral for those small communities with no jobs, no income, no resources for the schools. That downward spiral starts. And then in the larger cities, you have more pressure on housing, more pressure on schools, more pressure. So housing becomes more expensive, schools become more crowded, and so with the job guarantee, it allows workers to stay where they are in their own communities. It allows the property values to be maintained. It allows the school district to have the same level of funding and resources and teachers, and it allows for less pressure on housing, on resources in the larger cities, which means cost of living in larger cities will be more reasonable. And cost of living in rural areas, which is attractive, becomes an advantage for smaller cities to attract business, to attract economic activities, or to attract teachers and doctors, because you have the resources, you have the income in the community, so that you have nicer restaurants, so that you have better entertainment and better after-school programs. And that's what attracts families and communities, right? Especially for workers who can do remote work, who can be working from any city. And we've discovered this during the pandemic. A lot of people moved from the big cities to rural areas, or moved back home, right, to their family home or whatever, and they can still do their work. Now imagine if those same workers who are now working remotely from a small rural area in Ohio instead of New York City, imagine if they actually have, a community where there's entertainment and restaurants and schools and after-school programs and broadband infrastructure and a great hospital system. They're going to think twice about moving back to the expensive city, to the crowded areas, for a variety of reasons, right? And that allows us to depressurize the entire system and kind of stabilize economic activity across the board, as opposed to having these handful of larger cities where the opportunities are, and then a downward spiral of economic insecurity, which feeds into fewer resources for schools, which feeds into the opioid crisis, which feeds into so many other problems that we see all over small towns and the deindustrialized Midwest, in particular, where I live here in Ohio.
And imagine having the ability, if you are in a lousy job, or you had to move because of your employment, or you're in an abusive relationship and you're locked into a situation where you can't leave because it's expensive to move. And if you want to move to a different place, when you get there, you have to find a job. Imagine if we had a job guarantee where it didn't matter where you were in the U.S., that the federal government guaranteed you a job wherever you went to. That would allow people to leave situations that were bad or abusive or things like that. Absolutely.
And I'm glad you mentioned this, because the other thing that the hidden cost of unemployment is massive, and it's hidden because most of us don't usually think about it. But there's tons of studies, not just in the US, all over the world, that show that every time we have high levels of unemployment, we have high levels of depression, anxiety, suicide, domestic violence, child abuse, crime, and additional costs for prisons and courts and police and guards and all of that. So all of what the job guarantee does is not going to solve all of those social problems, but it will substantially reduce the cost, the hidden costs, financial costs, but also emotional cost, emotional pain to individuals and communities and societies. So that's the massive, benefit of the job guarantees, in addition to the macroeconomic effects, the productivity effects, and all of that. It's just the quality of life effects. And when people say we can't afford it, it's too expensive, you start crunching the numbers for the cost of incarceration, the cost of the opioid crisis, the cost of domestic violence and child abuse and all of it, just financial cost. And it turns out that the job guarantee is actually dirt cheap compared to what we're already paying, right? So we're already paying for all of these costs. What we're saying is, let's pay less and get more of social and economic benefits under a job guarantee program. I don't think anybody will oppose that.
No, absolutely not. So, Carrie, we're getting towards the end of our show, and I've only talked about half of what I wanted to.
Yeah, we've got to have you come back. And I just want to make this point because I went through, I tried to find the best objections, reasonable objections to this proposal. And I kept going back to Wall Street Journal and Forbes. That is where the biggest objectors are. And for a progressive, I recognize who they're talking to. And they're not talking to somebody like me, who is, a small business owner, disabled, and trying to make ends meet. So we need to have that conversation about where this pushback really is and what I can do. If I favor this program, and it sounds pretty good, if I favor this program, what can I do to enact this change and to start pushing back on this? And you're right, Andy, we haven't even scratched the surface. So
I have to add one more thing before we close today. Otherwise, somebody's going to post this in the comments. And I'm glad you reminded me when you said small business. So we've talked about the Amazons and the Walmarts, and they can certainly afford it. They're not gonna go bankrupt when we introduce a job guarantee and when they have to raise their standards. But how about small businesses, right? If you have 3 or 4 employees and you're paying them minimum wage, how can you afford to compete when the wage now and benefits package is much higher? So again, in the US, we have this, difficult situation where the minimum wage has been so low for so long, and it's just unacceptable to do that. So it's going to be a big jump, a big transition. And it's not reasonable to accept that all small businesses will be able to afford this transition quickly. So the most important thing we should do for small businesses at a certain threshold of size of employees and so on is to exempt small businesses from the most burdensome taxes that they have to pay, which is the FICA tax at a minimum. That's a tax on the employee and on the employer, right? And this way you can even the level of competition. So you raise the wage by the equivalent of what you're saving from not having to pay the FICA tax. This way, small businesses can do the transition. Big businesses, they should still pay the FICA tax. They should pay other taxes too. So they should not be exempt from that. But small businesses, in order to be able to pay their employees a decent wage, the new benefits and wage package, they should be exempt from other tax burdens to allow them that quick transition. Otherwise, it's not going to be fair. Some businesses will be able to withstand it and afford it. Other small businesses will not. And we want to make sure that this is not a policy to displace small businesses in favor of larger businesses.
Right. And eventually, eventually, right, if you are taking a huge chunk of the population and increasing their buying power, right, they now can participate more in the economy. Right. So So eventually that translates to more customers for those small businesses. And that's the difference, right? You don't have just a small segment of the population that can go buy those products. Like if you're a restaurant owner and you have a certain clientele, well, now you've increased the number of people that can go out and get a meal, that can afford to do that. And that's the difference. All those things help to create a more robust economy in a domino effect, right?
That's true in Andy. That's true in general at the macro level in big cities. But the smaller the cities, the smaller the businesses, the more painful that transition is. So I agree with you that overall, yes, it's going to produce that macroeconomic effect. But there will be, hundreds and hundreds of small businesses scattered in small towns where that effect will not kick in at full speed soon enough to save them. And that's why it's important to have this support.
Yes,
plus, we need to support small businesses anyway, compared to all the benefits we give to multinational corporations.
Right, and we do know this entity that is a currency issuer, right? I think it's the federal government that can help. Yes, that's right.
Yes.
Well, there was actually a bill that was introduced this week that I want to talk about on Friday that actually helps further this plan by leveling the playing field. Because when we talk about the struggle between small businesses and large businesses, a small business, a mom and pop restaurant, doesn't have $100,000 to give to a senator running for office, but Amazon does. This bill is actually circumventing Citizens United. It was introduced in the Senate. So I want to talk about that on Friday with our audience, because that is also pulling the rug out from under Citizens United and the imbalance that we're seeing with global corporations literally buying our representatives in Congress, and those representatives being told to take a program like Federal Jobs Guarantee or Medicare for All and set it aside. So I think all of these things are starting to come into place, and they're scattered about, but we can see them coming on the horizon, which is positive. So thank you so much for coming, and I'm definitely going to put you on the spot and get you to commit to come back.
Happy to do it. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. I so appreciate it, because I think you and Andy alone could go on a 3-hour rant, and it would just be fascinating to listen to the two of you go back and forth. And I really appreciate it, because as the questions were coming in, you couldn't see them, but you were answering them one by one. So it was perfect, and really appreciate it. So not just the jobs guarantee, but so many other policies and the good work you're doing. As well as the article that you just had published on the Green New Deal. So we posted a link in the chat, and we'll do it again so that everybody gets a chance to read it, digest it, and then when you come back, we can, maybe push back a little bit and have a better understanding of what that article was about. So that would be great.
Happy to do it. Thanks again for doing this, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Andy, closing thoughts?
I have a podcast to edit, so we better get the heck out of here.
Okay, all right. So on that note, we've also included a link to the Macro and Cheese that Andy is working on that actually features Dr. Kaboub in that episode. So go and listen to it and help Andy out on his viewers on that front too. But from all of us here at DLF, thank you so much for tuning in to Hair of the Dog this morning, and we will be back on Friday post-inauguration. I definitely want to talk about that new bill that's coming in the Senate, what you can do to forward that kind of information to your neighbors and help get something like that passed. So thank you, and enjoy your Wednesday.
That was an absolutely wonderful conversation, Fadhel. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk soon. We'll see you in a couple of days. Take care, everyone.
We bout that, ayy. We in the zone, we out here, yeah. Spitting the facts, how it's supposed to be. Hair of the dog, we keep it in G.